Hi everybody, and welcome to the Sith IELTS and PT channel. My name is Sithuka and I am the head teacher and founder of the Sith IELTS and PT school. So today we are going to talk about something very important, and that is about what are the most important elements of the listening IELTS test. So before we get into the test video itself, if you think you are going to learn something from this video, and if you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to my channel so you will always get the new videos that I put out. And also please press that notification icon, the bell icon, so when I do put out a new video, you will get the notification. So let's move on to the most important elements of the listening IELTS test. First and foremost, when it comes to the difficulty level, most people believe that the listening test is the second easiest exam out of all the 4 modules in the IELTS test. So, as you all know, the IELTS test comprises with the writing test, the speaking test, the listening test, and the reading test. So those 4 elements are there. So the speaking test itself is considered the easiest by most, because the test itself is not divided like to a segment to the general students or for the academic students itself. Both the general and the academic students face the same test in the speaking test as well. So just like in the speaking test, in the listening test, there are no differences for the general or the academic students, right? The exact same test is given to all the students. Like for example, if I'm doing the academic test and my friend is doing the general test in the same date, same time, he will also get the same test and the same listening audio as me. So the exam itself, the listening data test exam itself, is aimed for both the general and academic students to face at the same time. So because the listening test is made for the general students and the academic students to face at the same time, it's normally considered somewhat easy, right? When you compare it to the writing and the reading test, where the general students and the academic students will get 2 different types of tests for writing and reading itself. So it's going to be aimed specifically at which party, and the difficulty level will increase or decrease depending on if you're a general student or an academic student. But like I said earlier, right, in this test, it's the same thing. It's the same thing. So everybody will get the same paper. So because of that, the exam itself is somewhat easy, particularly compared to the reading and the writing segments. Now, we will get into the structure of the listening test. Right? So when you think about the listening test, there are 40 questions, right? The listening test is also comprised of 4 segments: part 1, part 2, part 3, part 4. In each of those parts, in each of those segments, there are 10 questions. Part 1, there's 10. Part 2, there's 10. Part 3, there's 10. Part 4, there's 10. Right? So we have 40 questions altogether. So in order to do those 40 questions, there's a listening audio which doesn't really have a specific time per se. It usually lasts for roughly 20 minutes. So within that 20-minute time period, we will listen to the listening audio and we have to write the answers. And when we dive into the audio itself, it's very important to understand the audio will be only played once. It'll be only played once. So it is important for us to listen to it very attentively, focus, and make sure that we write the answer once, right? Because most of the time, the listening audio itself will be okay and there won't be any issues. But there have been rare instances where certain people, they had some issues with their headphones and they weren't able to listen to it very clearly or very properly. So if for some reason, if there's something wrong with your headphones, if you couldn't hear it properly, if there's any trouble sound in there, please immediately raise your hand and tell the invigilator or the examiners there, saying like, hey, there's something wrong with my headphones. Can you please have a look into it? Because if you wait for another 2-3 minutes, or if you wait until the end of the exam to say there was something wrong with it, they will probably ask you and say like, why did you tell us earlier, right? So never wait. If you ever have any of the issues, which I'm pretty sure you won't, it's very rare because every time before they do the listening test, they check it, right? But if for some reason, if there are any issues with your headphones and you can't hear it clearly, some of the words are not coming out clearly and there's treble sound, immediately raise your hand and tell the examiner that there is something wrong with the headphones and to please have a look. So they will somehow give you some sort of retribution for it. And further moving on about the listening audio, with the listening audio, there will be different accents, right? So For me, for as an example, me, I have a Sri Lankan sort of based accent, right? So you will most likely get in the listening audio different types of accent. Sri Lankan accents, maybe Indian, maybe Asian, maybe American, maybe English, maybe British, maybe Irish, maybe Scottish. You can't really tell like what sort of accents you are in there, but you are going to get different accents. So it is important for all of us to make sure that we have plenty of practice before we go to the exam. So the more practice you have, the more listening audios you have cover, more listening exam that you cover, it will be beneficial for you, because that way you will understand and you will be able to sample different type of accents, right? So most likely one of the most common accents that you get is like the British accent. British accent is very common in there. Sometimes you get the Asian accent, sometimes the Indian, African accent. So make sure that you understand and you get a grasp and you get a feel for different type of accents. So like I said earlier, make sure that you have plenty of practice, do plenty of listening exams so that you will cover a majority of the accents that you get. And the other important thing is, regardless of the accent that you get, sometimes you might get a really thick accent, sometimes it will be very clear. Regardless of the accent that you get, what I can tell you is the answers itself and the audio itself will be quite clear, right? The way the listening exam is made is in a way it's such it's like it's quite clear. Regardless of the accent, it's quite clear, right? So make sure that you focus and listen attentively and intently, and so that way you will be able to get the answers regardless of the accent they have, right? So make sure, like I said earlier a couple of times, right? Plenty of practice. Plenty of practice. After that, you will be able to understand what the answers are, what the solutions are. Even regardless of the accent, you will be able to understand what they're saying. So plenty of practice to get a feel for all the accents. And the other important thing is spelling, right? So there will be questions where we have to answer and we have to write down the answer. So spelling is extremely important. Regardless of you get the answer right or wrong, spelling has to be accurate. Even if you got the answer, it is the right answer. If one of the letters are false and it's not supposed to be there, there's a spelling mistake there, unfortunately they will cut down the mark. So most of the time it's like 1 mark per one question, right? 1 mark per one question. So if you get like spelling wrong for that regarding on that answer or the word itself, then they will cut down the marks. So make sure that you also improve your vocabulary as well. The better your vocabulary is, the more you have the knowledge for the words, and the spelling will be most of the time correct. So make sure that you increase your vocabulary. That way the words that will be most likely in the listening audio will be also in your mind, so you will know what the correct spellings are. So vocabulary is also very important, right? And again, like I said earlier, the more listening exams, even when you do reading exams, when we go through the reading passages and you will see certain words and certain answers, certain segments, and particularly when you're doing the writing tasks as well, when you write down task 1, task 2, the essays itself, you will improve your vocabulary. So that skill, that improving your vocabulary skill, will also be important in the listening exam itself, right? So remember, spelling is very important, very important. And finally, before we go into the IELTS segments itself, the part 1, part 2, part 3, part 4, the other important thing I have to tell you is there will be time for you to transfer the answers from your question paper to the answer sheet. Some of the students, when they come to my class, before they come to my class, they were thinking like, oh sir, I thought we have to write the answer straight away in the answer sheet. And it's not the case, right? Make sure that you always write your answer while you're listening to the audio in the question paper itself. You will get around 10 minutes after listening audio finishes for you to transfer it to the listening answer sheet, the answer sheet itself. So always make sure that you listen to the audio and write the answers down in the question paper itself. And then after the listening audio finishes, you have 10 minutes, which is plenty of time, more than enough time for you to transfer the answers to the answer sheet. So in that 10-minute time period, if you feel that you have made some spelling mistakes, you can correct it and you can go through it again and see if you have done the answers again. You have plenty of time. So make sure always listen to the audio and listen and put the answers in the question paper itself. Never ever listen to the audio, look at the question paper, and write the answer sheet at the same time. So they are doing 3 things at the same time. It's incredibly difficult. Why make it difficult? Why make it complex? Just listen to the audio, and write down the answers in the question paper, which is much easier and is much more, which will be much more accurate. Right? So make sure that you always write down the answers in the question paper. After the audio finishes, you have 10 minutes to transfer the answers from your question paper to the answer sheet. Right. So now let's get into the parts. Part 1, Part 2, Part 3, Part 4 in the listening test. So first of all, we will start with listening test Part 1. When it comes to listening test Part 1, it's going to give you a scenario where it's in an everyday general setting. It's basically, imagine like you and your friend or you and your family talking about the weather or the family or food or whatever in an everyday general context. So listening test part one of the listening test is considered the easiest part out of all those 4 parts, right? So that's where you can get the most marks, right? Now, I'm not telling you to not focus on the other 3, but this is the easiest part, right? The easiest part. So this is where you can focus. This is where you can focus more and probably get the most marks, right? So it will be in, like I said earlier, everyday general context. So the topics will be similar, but topics will be easier. It will be something most likely you might even know, right? And even in the listening test part 1, what they will do is, right, when you compare to part 2, part 3, part 4, in part 1, the audio is also quite simplified, right? The vocabulary will be simple. The speed itself will be simple. When they give the answers, they highlight the answers. What I mean by saying highlight the answers, when they tell the answer, they sometimes increase the tone, increase the volume of the answer, and also less speed. As an example, let's say we have a conversation between Alex and John, right? So Alex wants to know where John lives, right? So Alex is asking, hey John, where do you live? Right? So the answer is obviously going to be the city where John lives. So John's answer would be, I live in Brisbane. I live in Brisbane. Like when you say Brisbane, the volume increases and also the tone like softens up and the word is pronounced slowly. Right? So again, Alex is asking, hey John, where do you live? I live in Brisbane. I live in Brisbane. Like see, when you say Brisbane, the volume increases and its tones kind of like smooths out and it's pronounced more slowly. So it's highlighted. It's highlighted. That's what I mean. They will highlight the answer. So part 1 is generally considered the easiest part because, like I said earlier, right? The tone itself is clearer, the speed is slower, the vocabulary is easy, and of course they are going to highlight the answer. So part 1 is generally considered the easiest part out of the all 4 parts in the listening test. Now we will go to listening test part 2. Listening test part 2. In part 1, there was a conversation, right, between 2 or more people in everyday general context, right? Part 2 is also somewhat easy, right? Somewhat easy, because just like part 1, part 2 is also aimed kind of at the general students, right? Like I said earlier in the video, right? It doesn't matter if you're a general student or academic student, you're going to face the same exam, the same question paper. So part 1 and part 2 is mostly aimed at the general student. So it will be very easy for the academic students because they're doing academic levels, and it'll be quite easy for the general students as well. For part 1, very easy, that's the easiest part. Part 2 is also quite easy. So in part 2, the difference between part 1 and part 2 is, in the part 2, there's like a monologue. It's basically speech. So one person talking about an element or a product or a service or something in an everyday general context. So it could be a map or a place or an item or a product or a service or a person. It could be something like that, right? It could be something like that it's in a general everyday context. So again, could be potentially something that we already know about, right? So it'll be again somewhat easy. I would say probably not as easy as part 1, but still quite easy. Again, the vocabulary will be quite easy. The tone they will be speaking, it would be a little bit smoother, and the speed will be a little bit slower. And again, the answers that they will tell could be highlighted, right? So again, when they come to the answers itself, the words that they will be used for the answers would be highlighted, as in the tone would be smoother, the volume would be a little bit higher, and it will be pronounced slowly, right? So part 2 is basically a monologue again, right? A speech, and it would be somewhat easy compared to part 3 and part 4. So now we will get into listening test part 3. Okay, now this is the area. Now it's going to be a little bit difficult, a little bit difficult. Again, it's not going to be incredible difficult or nobody can do the answer itself. It's still quite manageable. It's still quite easy to certain people, but it will be compared to part 1 and part 2, where it was aimed at mostly at general students. Part 3 and part 4, it's aimed at mostly at the academic students. But again, general academic, you have the same paper, you have to do it. But and like I said to the general students or even the academic students, there's nothing to be afraid of, right? It's quite easy when you practice it, right? When you practice it, it's quite easy. It becomes almost like a habit. So, either way, we are going to talk about part 3. Part 3, it's mostly aimed at academic students, like I said. Again, just like part 1 and part 2, you will have 10 questions, right? But this time, right, the accents will be a little bit thicker, the speed will be a little bit faster, the vocabulary could be a little bit more complex, and the highlighting of the answers is a little bit less. So it's going to be a little bit difficult. And the context that they speak is in an academic setting. So it could be a school or it could be even an office setting where they're going to talk about a project or about a subject or something. And most likely there will be a conversation between 2 or 3 people, right? So it's going to be a bit difficult compared to part 1 and part 2. But again, it's about practice, guys. If you practice and practice and practice, you will get a feel for it and you will see it's not that difficult as some people say it is, right? So it's about practice. So make sure when you get into part 3 and part 4, you have to focus on part 1 and part 2 and part 1 and part 2 as well. But with part 3 and part 4, just take it to that next level. You have to focus more because like I said, the audio will be a little bit faster, the accents could be thicker, the vocabulary could be a little bit complex, the highlighting of the answers could be a little bit less. So you have to focus a bit more in there, right? So, but like I said earlier, it's not as difficult, right? So make sure that you focus well and you have plenty of practice. And like I said earlier, it'll be on an academic setting, right? It's aimed mostly at the academic students, right? So it's going to be a little bit more difficult than part 1 and part 2, but again, not really that difficult when you think about it. Okay, now we are going to get to the last part, which is listening test part 4. This is considered by most as the hardest part, which I also agree. In part 4, there's going to be a monologue, just like in part 2, but in part 4, it's going to be again in an academic setting. Because like I said earlier, part 3 and part 4 are mostly focused for the academic students, right? So it's going to be a tad more difficult than part 3 most of the time anyways, right? So in an academic setting, that means most likely a teacher or a professor or a doctor or somebody who's an expert in a certain field will have a speech, will give you a speech, right? So most of the time before they get into the subject matter itself, they will tell what they're going to talk about and how it's going to be structured. So it makes it a little bit easy for the students who are doing part 4 because they will have an understanding of what they're going to talk about before they start part 4, right? So like I said earlier, it's similar to part 3. Again, the accents could be thicker, like the speed could be a little bit more faster. There will not, the intonation might be a little bit less, where they are stopping through and the pitch is going up and down. It's not as prominent, and also the answers might not be as well highlighted, right? Because they're going through too fast, right? And like I said, the vocabulary goals could be also complex depending on the setting itself. But again, just like in part 3, guys, even though it's comparatively it's difficult than part 1 and part 2 and potentially more difficult than part 3, right? It's about practice, right? The reason why I'm highlighting this practice thing is, again, everybody when they start, including myself, when you start itself, when you are getting used to the structure of the listening test, it could be a little bit problematic. But after you do the listening test 1, 2, 3 times, you're like, it's okay. It's actually all right. It's about getting used to it, just like everything in life. When you start something, when you're at the beginning of it and this is the first time or second time when you're doing it, of course you're going to run into some troubles. It's a normal thing, right? But as long as, as you progress and you get a feel for it, then all those little errors slowly start to melt away, right? So that's why I'm highlighting this practice thing all the time. That's what I tell all my students: practice makes perfect, right? Practice makes perfect. You practice. I guarantee you will improve, right? Same. So I'm telling you in part 3, part 4, and now with part 4 we're talking about. Again, it would be a little bit difficult, but again, guys, practice. Do as much audios, do as much listening tests as you want, right? The more you do it, the better you will get, right? So like I said earlier, part 4 is a little bit difficult than part 1 and part 2 and part 3 most of the time, right? The context is more really difficult, the vocabulary is a bit more complex, and also the speed of the listening audio will be a little bit faster, the tone and the accent, right, could be a little bit stronger, and the highlighting of the answers might not be as prominent. But again, practice, guys. After you play, good practice, have you as like maybe like 5-6 sessions, right, of listening audios, then you will feel like, oh, it's not as difficult. So make sure that you practice a lot. And one more very important tip I have to tell you guys is, like, I have to give you guys is like about an error, about a mistake that almost everybody does, including myself in the beginning, right? So what this error is, like focusing on the question that you missed, right? What do I mean by that? So most of the time when you start with the listening test, when you start to progress through it, there will be parts where you are listening to the audio, right? When you're listening to the audio and you are waiting for the answer and the answer is already gone, but you're still focused on that question that you missed, like thinking like, oh no, what's the answer for this? Did I miss it? Right? Did I miss it? What's going on? Or am I going to lose a mark for this? Right? So while we are thinking all of that, the audio is still going, right? So make sure that you never do that. It's a practice, it's a habit that you have to get. Okay, so make sure if you feel that you missed that question, if you feel that you lost that answer, just leave it, right? Never ever think about it too much, never ever dwell on it, right? What happens is, like I said earlier, when you're thinking, oh no, did I miss this question, did I miss this mark, I'm going to lose 1 point, while you're thinking all of that, you already missed like the answers for 5 questions. So because of 1 mark, you're going to lose 5 marks more. Okay, so make sure that you never ever do that. I just want to highlight that, because that it's a problem, it's a mistake that almost everybody does, right, at the beginning particularly. So make sure if you miss a question and if you feel like, okay, it's gone, I can't see the answer, gone, just forget about it, right? Forget about it and listen to the audio and make sure that you cover the other parts, other questions, right? Like I said earlier, because of 1 question, because of 1 point, because of 1 mark, don't lose 4 or 5 marks. Okay, right? So it's very important that you learn to just forget about it and move on and focus on the audio and move on to the next question, because you have another, like I said earlier, you have 10 minutes, roughly 10 minutes to transfer the solutions, the answer that you did on the question paper to the answer sheet itself. In that 10 minutes, there's a chance that you might actually heard the answer and you think like, I got this word there. So, and it matches the question as well. So I'll probably write it there. Could be right. It could be right. So, but either way, make sure that you don't do that. Make sure that you don't dwell upon the questions or the answers that you miss, because most likely you will miss a lot of marks, because if you keep dwelling on that question. So never ever do that. So yeah, guys, that's it for the most important elements and segments of the listening test itself. So in a future video, what I will do is I will cover the listening skills. So because there are certain skills that you could implement to get higher marks for the listening test, and also cover certain question types that you will get for the listening test itself. So in a future video, I will be doing some of those, which will be also again important and which will give you more of a practical experience for the listening test exam. So I will be doing one of those videos in the future. And yeah, guys, so we are all covered with the listening important segments. I believe in the next video I will be talking about the writing task 1, whether it's for the general or the academic test, because it's 2 different types. I will be talking about that, and I will be putting 2 separate videos for discussing the most important elements for the writing task 1 general and writing task 1 academic itself. So yes, so again, I hope you enjoyed this video and I hope you learned something. If you did, please give it a like or a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel, so I'll put some more new videos out. And also make sure that you put press that notification bell icon, so when I do put the videos out, you will get a notification saying there's a video from Sith IELTS PTE. So yes, thank you very much for spending your valuable time looking at this video. And again, like I said, I hope you enjoyed it and I hope you learned something from it. So then I will talk to you guys in the next video. All right, then take care, be safe, guys, and I will see you all then. Take care. God bless. Bye.